unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here with Margaret O'Mara, who is a professor of history at the University of Washington and also the author of this book here called The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. Welcome, Margaret.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Look, this was fascinating for someone who lives here and breathes this stuff and actually knows a bunch of the people in the book or have met a bunch of the people in the book. It was really fascinating for me to go back and look at the early days of Silicon Valley before I showed up over here. I've been here for 20 years, and most of this history, of course, takes place before that. And what this history does, I mean, it explores much of the origins that I think most people are somewhat unfamiliar with. I mean, I think there is a myth of Silicon Valley, right, that we all talk about. And the parts that usually don't get articulated all that well are the kind of relationships between Silicon Valley's success story and the role of the government. And I think that plays a big role in your book, right? Not only the spending that the military did, but also the kind of lobbying and the various legal changes and the legal and regulatory infrastructure, which really took place that made possible Silicon Valley. So I guess, first of all, when you were entering grad school, you had no intention of studying Silicon Valley. What on earth made you want to kind of study this material?
That's a great question. Yeah, I came to grad school after working in Washington, D.C. I worked in the Clinton administration. And funnily enough, I spent part of that time working in the office of Vice President Al Gore, the famous techie in chief. And I didn't work on tech policy. Of all things, I worked on a program called Empowerment Zones. It was about capital infusion into,
I remember that.
into under-resourced urban areas. And what I realized, actually, what I learned in Washington was this: how the business and politics, the private sector, the public sector, were far from being two separate domains, but were deeply, deeply interconnected, and got a full appreciation for kind of that a true interconnection, that this was not either a public sector story or a private sector story. The story of American economic growth, the story of America is one of both. It's not of, unfettered free markets, nor is it about centralized planning. It's kind of this very distinctively American, federalized, decentralized system. And so when I was in graduate school, I was kind of actually, what brought me to Silicon Valley was President Eisenhower. I was really interested in looking at the 1950s and looking at the domestic economic impacts of the Cold War without electronics really squarely in my sights at the time. It was just more like, okay, we had this extraordinary upsurge of spending, and what did that do to the American economic geography? How did it move industry and people south and west? And then within that story, I discovered, there's this high-tech knowledge economy story that the actual geography of high tech. And I was really embarking in earnest on this dissertation project in the late 90s. So the dot-com boom was starting to boom. And it was the same places that had been present for this surge of spending. And number one was Silicon Valley. Also Boston, obviously, which was, people forget, was kind of number one when it came to tech well into the 80s. Silicon Valley was kind of the little brother, scrappy little brother to Boston. But that was really what brought me to it. So I kind of funnily enough, came to tech through politics and through a kind of background and interest in economic policy and social policy. So I like to think that's kind of in a way, it was a disadvantage first coming to study the computer industry, hardware and software, and not being a technical person. I was like, oh gosh, I have these, I know how to use these things, but I don't know how to build these things. And I think that actually, I have learned a lot since. I know a lot more about how they work than I used to. But I think it's really important for all of us as users of this technology to have a way to understand it and understand its history, even if we don't know, even if we aren't programmers ourselves.
Well, look, I spent a lot of time with government officials who are trying to figure out how to replicate their own Silicon Valley, whether it's the Silicon Steppe or the Silicon jungle or, whatever it is. And of course, there are some features that we might call, I don't know, exogenous or whatever, that would make it more likely that Silicon Valley would be the place where all of this happens. But there's also quite a bit of historical accident, right? And individuals who make choices and strategic decisions that alter the course of history. And of course, as an historian, you're constantly trying to figure out like how much of this is contingency and how much is other stuff. But, you mentioned Boston. I mean, Vannevar Bush was the super key figure, I think, in 20th century. And he was, of course, an MIT guy, right? And so, and of course, Fred Terman spent time at Harvard during the war. And I think Stanford, of all places, got virtually nothing during the war. And so why didn't Boston turn out to be the place where all of this ultimately happened?
Well, it did for a while, and the computer industry itself was very much an East Coast creation. Well through the 1980s, and it's really only with personal consumer electronics, video games, personal computers, and then the internet that the West Coast really takes precedent. I think part of it is rather than thinking of these as two regions that were kind of in competition with one another, they're so deeply connected. Fred Terman, the Stanford Dean of Engineering and later provost, who's kind of known informally as the father of Silicon Valley, he was the first doctoral student of Bush at MIT. So they had a close relationship. He was back on the East Coast during the war because Bush brought him back there. And so he saw firsthand not only what was happening during the war with the OSRD, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, but also the template that Bush is laying out for Roosevelt and Truman after the war for a broad peacetime investment in university-based research. And Terman sees this as Stanford's moment. He famously, memorably, he writes to a colleague around the end of the war saying, look, Stanford could, continue to be a respectable research institution, kind of like a Dartmouth, or we could be like Harvard. And so there's this very strategic, that Stanford, not only Terman, but other administrators really set out to remake the university. And because it's a private university, as opposed to, a public university like University of California, Berkeley, or my institution, the University of Washington, it's able to do that. It's able to build up physics and related disciplines, as Terman et al. Do. And when you do that, there are other things. You can't do everything well at once, right? So they did what Terman memorably called steeples of excellence. We have certain things we're really good at. And that was really critical. Why didn't Boston stay on top? I think that's a really good question. And it's something that I think, it's always good to remember and sort of denaturalize the kind of inevitability of Silicon Valley. It's easy to romanticize, Hewlett and Packard and their starting up HP in a garage in Palo Alto in 1939 and say, of course, it was destined to be this way. But there were guys in garages all over the United States in the 1930s and 40s. They weren't unusual in that. I think what really one of the great advantages that I see emerging and what I trace in the book is what I call the entrepreneurial Galapagos of the South Bay, of Silicon Valley, which is that it was kind of the only game in town. It was this very distinctive ecosystem that develops there. In this 40 miles south in San Francisco, the only business there is prunes and apricots.
The fruit orchards, right?
Yeah, fruit orchards. It's an agricultural area with this university in the middle, this kind of strange folly founded by a robber baron. The farm. Yeah. So again, no one's saying this is going to be President Eisenhower did not say, I shall build a science city in Palo Alto, California. So I think that's sort of to your earlier observation about all the silicon steps and these places that have tried to build themselves a silicon something. I think part of the challenge has been so much about Silicon Valley itself was sort of this organic accident. Yes, there were people, there were top-down forces, defense spending, Cold War spending among them. There were bottom-up people like Fred Terman, kind of for taking advantage, seizing that opportunity. There were entrepreneurial leaders like Hewlett Packard and the founders of firms like Fairchild Semiconductor. Like, yes, it's this entrepreneurial energy on the ground and also these bigger circumstances. So I think that isolation and being far away and being, all they're doing is small electronics and communication devices. That's it. And there are about 4 places you can go to dinner, and they all close at 9:00. And, people were just able to, it was a monoculture of sorts, but it also had very kind of distinctive service firms that grow up around there. Venture capital, the brand of venture capital that emerges in the Valley starting in the early 1960s is very much catering to the distinctive needs of small military electronics firms founded by young engineers who know nothing about running a business. And it grows from there, right? So, and it's all tightly networked. All these people know each other. They're doing business with each other. They're hopping from one company to another. It's this networked ecosystem that Boston is far different. Boston's, a major metropolitan area and has a lot going on. It's home to very large companies. This is, of course, Annalise Saxenian's landmark book, Regional Advantage, which compares the two regions and their business cultures. And how, here we are on unSILOed. Silicon Valley was unSILOed, while Boston was very siloed because it had Raytheon and these big firms that were not kind of seeding ideas across different places.
Now, there are a couple of different ways that government money could make its way into place like Silicon Valley. One is with, grants, research grants. And I think, Vannevar Bush, that was his main contribution, right, was to create this research agenda for the government. The second way, of course, is through purchases of military equipment and so forth. And, Lockheed Martin was a big player, I think, in Silicon Valley. A lot of us forget. And the third way would be through investment. And so that was the small business SBIC program. And they all seem to have, differential importance over time. And one would think that if the Vannevar Bush kind of research grant was the main avenue, then places like, say, UC Berkeley would be well positioned, right, with the, nuclear atomic bomb initiative and so forth. And so, which of those turned out to be kind of the most important when we think about Silicon Valley?
Gosh, it's hard to rank them because they have such a symbiotic relationship in practice. Research money for universities is not only seeding basic research in labs and then seeding spin-off companies and commercializing technologies from those labs, but it's also educating people. Really, when you look kind of dollar for dollar about, when you look at Stanford, for example, if you just look at the tech space, I think biotech is different. Medical sciences are different because you have more of that kind of pipeline of from lab to startup in that space. But when you're looking at computer hardware and software, it's more about the people that went to Stanford that went on to found companies, right? Everyone from, Hewlett and Packard to Brennan Page and everyone in between. It's kind of a people factory. So that's part of it. And that federal money is paying for people, for science and engineering programs. So that's a really important component. I think that the dimension of the government as customer is a really important thing too, as a major defense contractor, as a kind of creating a demand for these development of these advanced computational devices when there is no commercial market for them. And this is not just the defense space, it's also the space race, which of course was all part of the Cold War race itself. It was, why did we go to the moon? We wanted to beat the Soviets there. But that's a great, look at the case of the integrated circuit, the microchip. This is developed, invented in the early 1960s by, among others, Bob Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor in the Valley. And it's a very expensive, bespoke device that no Fortune 50 company really needs then. And it's very expensive. But who needs it? NASA. You need it on the Apollo guidance system. So NASA orders up a whole bunch of ICs from Fairchild. It kind of keeps the gets them off the ground. That's their launch pad of the rocket ship that is essentially a silicon semiconductor industry in the Valley. And in doing that allows the production to scale up, cost to drive down, so by the time you get, go down a few years, by the time you get to the late 1960s, 1968, when Intel was founded, you have a viable commercial product. It is, Intel is not a defense contractor. It's not a NASA contractor primarily. Yes, it has some federal business, but most of its business is the enterprise. So that's an important dimension. And I think there's, kind of the both and again of the phenomenon that I observed when I was a 20-something in Washington, D.C. in the room where it happened, on the periphery, watching people actually, make decisions, but realizing, oh my gosh, the public and private sectors are not these discrete sides of two sides of an argument. It's not like they always get along, but the way in which the U.S. does business is through this, government subsidy, through grants, through indirect, distributing spending through private sector contractors or private universities. So it's kind of these multiple levels that allow, in the case of advanced electronics, to a greater degree than some other fields, kind of allowed a great deal of entrepreneurial energy. And my analogy I like to use is think about it as a sandbox that the U.S. government, in the height of the Cold War, the sort of research R&D spending sort of that crests in the early 60s in the wake of Sputnik, that they're building the wooden box for the sandbox. They're putting the sand in. And then they're letting the scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs get in there and just throw sand at each other and build sandcastles. And so that's this sort of wonderful both and that's, again, distinctively American and kind of has both sides. You can have your entrepreneurial heroes and you can have your big government too. They actually coexist.
Yeah. And of course, later on, DARPA played a huge role, right, in the origin of the internet.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's the internet is a Pentagon project, but it's really not a Pentagon project thought up by the generals. It's thought up by computer scientists who are embedded in DARPA who are like, what if we did this? We're trying to get computers to communicate. Maybe we can get the Pentagon to pay for this. And it was initially a $1 million price tag, which for, even in 1969 for the Pentagon, they were like, oh, we can do that. We can play around with that. And it was a bunch of academic grantees, Pentagon grantees in different academic institutions that are using the early ARPANET that becomes the internet to communicate with one another by computer. It's this very, and it remains a government-run network for 20 years.
Yeah, and if you look at the people who came out to Silicon Valley, right? They're pretty straight-laced people, right? We have this vision, at least a lot of people have this vision of the Bay Area as, being full of hippies and, long-haired lefties and so forth. And of course, later on, I think, with the homebrew club and so forth, that there's a little bit of that. But, for the most part, these were, people who, wore coat and tie, they were crew cutted and, Republican for the most part, right?
Yeah. There's sort of distinct generations, but although there is something that, and this is something that really hit home to me when I was doing research for the book, and I spent a lot of time doing long form interviews, oral history interviews with people who, by that point, were in their 80s and 90s, many of whom had been started off as operators, become venture capitalists, were kind of ending their lives as very, very wealthy individuals, but what I realized in talking to them about their early lives was they were almost to a man. They were all white men, to be clear, but they were not from privilege. They were not from wealth. And actually they ended up in California in the 50s and early 60s because they didn't have Ivy League connections or prep school educations or wealthy fathers and uncles in Wall Street banks and white shoe law firms or Fortune 50 companies in Rochester, New York, or wherever, which is the kind of the normal thing you did if you were that was the path to success then.
Well, there was this Rice Mafia that I didn't know about.
This Rice Mafia of these, Texas kids, many of whom were scholarship kids, that come out. And Burt McMurtry, the late Burt McMurtry, the venture capitalist, is someone I talked to extensively for the book, and he really gets credit for kind of starting that train. I mean, he and his wife came out in 1957 with, he came out because he could go to grad school for free at Stanford if he worked at Sylvania. They had a partnership program. To be clear, like, it's the other side of the country. All of yes, there's a bunch of military spending on the West Coast, but where the action is, IBM, the other big computer makers, all the action around Boston, it's all on the East Coast. And even the first, Silicon Valley tech companies, electronics companies, are headquartered somewhere else. They're either Lockheed Missiles and Space, headquartered in Southern California, or they're East Coasters like Lytton and Sylvania and IBM that have these branch offices out west. So they're kind of, in a way, that first generation with their crew cuts and their ties and their white shirts. Yeah, they're more square, but they also are a little bit, what you're forced to do when you move across the country or across the world. Of course, immigrants from outside the United States are a big part of the Valley story too, is you have to reinvent yourself and reinvent your world. And you are in a place where you can do that. And perhaps that does indeed encourage thinking outside the box, as they say, or thinking differently. And that's certainly the culture from the get-go really encouraged that to a far greater degree than the East Coast.
Yeah, and I think Xerox PARC is an example of a company that is based elsewhere that decided to kind of create an outpost. I mean, since then we've seen, like dozens of outposts of companies from all over the world. But I mean, what was the motivation behind Xerox PARC? Why did they think that they needed to have this, research facility out in the West Coast?
Yeah. So they open up by the early 70s, they are, Xerox is in a way following in the footsteps of sort of 15 years of East Coast-based companies that are establishing a research industrial lab out near Stanford. And part of it is as a result of Stanford working very, very hard to encourage these companies to set up these shops nearby. And Fred Terman, again, is the center of this story. He's kind of this human connection machine who really, his powers of persuasion were a big factor in William Shockley of Shockley Semiconductor, inventor of the transistor, to move out to the Valley in 56, for Lockheed Missiles and Space to locate in the Valley 1954, 55. And while Terman was already kind of on his, in moving towards retirement by the time Xerox is getting the idea that Xerox was, they're the classic innovator's dilemma company, right? They've made copiers, they're making bank on copiers, and they are interested in kind of getting into new lines of business and taking some of their hefty profits from copiers to advance the state of the art of the machines they were making, and also perhaps play around with other things. And so it was logical to kind of to move something out to the West Coast. Now, this was, Palo Alto was far, far, far away from Xerox headquarters, which was part of the secret of PARC, right? They kind of did their own thing. They had a pretty good budget to play with. And
it was also kind of the problem, right? Because then Xerox never really monetized, very much of this.
They didn't quite know what they were creating. I don't think there were many, VPs back at Xerox HQ that imagined the beanbags and the all-night games of Space War and these kind of legendary culture, that kind of the very California. Because of course, this is a different California. It's a different America by the time you get to the early 1970s. And one of the great advantages of Xerox PARC was that this was a generation that was coming of age, academically coming of age in the late 1960s. They're on the campuses of places like Berkeley and Stanford. They've gotten turned on to computers. They've gotten engineering educations. And the last thing they want to do is go work for a defense contractor. They want to do anything but that. They want to stay in, and they want to find a way to do what they do and work in this field without having to go work for a Lockheed or a Boeing.
I mean, you still have that. There's still a strain in places like Google where they're very reluctant to, let their work be used for military purposes.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Google is, I think of it as the child of that Vietnam era, like quite literally. You have computer scientists of that generation, like Terry Winograd who was the Stanford PhD advisor for Larry Page at Google. If you are a PhD student in Stanford computer science in the late 80s and the 90s and early 90s, as Larry and Sergey were, you were very much getting you're in that culture of that is sort of the post-defense Silicon Valley, and is very much kind of self-consciously thinking of itself as, we are not like big corporate bureaucracy. We're not like the Defense Department. We're here to not be evil.
Right. Now, of course, there is this whole other story, which is the kind of origins of what we now know of as venture capital. And, of course, there was the East Coast version. Everyone points to George Doriot, with his model. And then there was the Arthur Rock and, Bill Draper and Pitch Johnson, who came out to the West Coast and really invented. I mean, obviously, adventure capital has been around for a long time, but, they really did invent a new way of funding companies.
They did. And it's money and mentorship. It's this very, very intensive hands-on. And keep in mind, this early generation of venture capitalists, the Drapers, the Johnsons, they're young guys. They're playing with other people's money. Draper was kind of the only blue blood among that whole crew. He kind of came from, Yale education and had a famous father, but everyone else was kind of, playing with other people's money. Pitch Johnson kind of asked his father-in-law for a loan to start playing around with things and investing, but their youth and their outlook kind of made them open to, okay, there's opportunity here. And there was a willingness to be adventurous and make bets on what seemingly risky bets. Why does venture capital exist in the first place? Why does Dorio and others, why are we establishing these funds? Because banks would not lend to these new enterprises, that they were so beyond the pale of what was considered to be a wise or safe investment. This idea, the VC model of 1 in 10 is going to hit, one big hit's going to pay for all the failures. This risk tolerance that's kind of baked into the model is something that was alien to the financial system of the mid 20th century. That being said, I think the way that this model develops in the early to mid 1960s during what was termed the space age stock boom, when there was a lot of opportunity, your hits were coming faster than usual. So if you are a young VC driving around the fruit orchards looking for a converted shed where there's some electronics firm, as Johnson and Draper would do, your likelihood of getting a good return on that investment is relatively higher. Reed Dennis, who's another one of these early, very important venture capitalists, kind of said sort of in effect to me that, the deals were just raining down. There was just so much, it was kind of hard. You couldn't lose. You were doing really, really well in those early years because it was new, it was growing. There was suddenly this opportunity and no one else was doing these types of electronics that suddenly had this demand.
Well, it must have been very adventurous because nowadays almost every venture capital is either a former operator or a former founder. But these folks, I guess John Doerr was an operator at one point, but most of these folks were not former founders or operators. And so they really were, providing advice and mentorship without actually having, experience. They were making it up as they went along, right?
Well, some of them, they had some operational experience, but not necessarily all as founders. There was the model of, first of all, there were fewer companies and fewer founders, but you did, and they weren't all necessarily technical people. There were a lot of people who were sales and marketing people who went into, someone like Don Valentine, founder of Sequoia, was but they came from the chip industry. And I think that the fact that the chip industry, of the 60s is kind of the source of so many of these iconic venture capitalists and these firms. It explains a lot because the chip industry was You had to move fast. You had to break things. You had to elbow competitors out of the way. You had to be first to market, fastest to market. You had to get your, not just a toehold, but a big foothold in the market quickly. And you had to be able to iterate, move, be extraordinarily flexible. Now, the extreme founder friendliness of the last couple of decades in the Valley is something that this earlier era did not necessarily have. There were plenty of stories of founders getting booted from their companies. And the venture model initially was, we come in, we give you funding, we give you legal support and counsel and advice and board you, and then we kind of nudge you kids out to the kids who start the company get moved to some kind of secondary role, and you bring in adult supervision, someone who knows how to run things. And that is, but it's a very, you're right in that these are all people who are kind of, by and large, they're not seasoned corporate executives when they're coming in to become funders. They're all still, relatively young as they're doing this. They're not seasoned financiers. You don't have that kind of Wall Street to Valley back and forth that exhibits, we see in later years, like the last 30 years or so, there's been so much cross-pollination, but earlier, not so much.
Now, one of the heroes of the book is, I think, Regis McKenna. And I think that's a part of the Silicon Valley story that doesn't get enough attention. I did a recent podcast where we talked about how design and UX and UI is, so critical, and that doesn't get a lot of attention. But what McKenna did, by basically branding, and bringing, savvy marketing into the Valley. I guess this was relatively fresh because prior to that, everything was either B2B or, basically just was sold on the basis of pure functionality.
Yes. Regis McKenna is an extraordinarily important person. He comes to the Valley in the 1960s, early 60s. He's kind of famously, helps Intel kind of brand itself in the early years of the microprocessor and the kind of 60s, 70s. And by the late 1970s, he's after some cajoling, Steve Jobs persuades him to take on Apple as a client.
Cajoling? Didn't he call him like 800 times?
Oh, yeah. Oh, he was, I think he must have, he just persistence pays off. Steve, way to go. And keep in mind, Regis was kind of by that point, sort of a blue chip guy. He's sort of the big deal guy in Silicon Valley. If you're going to be doing marketing, advertising, PR, corporate positioning and corporate comms of all kinds. And Apple is two barefoot kids in a garage. Like this is, and they're
smelly kids too.
Smelly kids, and they're not even like they don't even necessarily have like what's considered to be the most technically sophisticated or best personal computer. Now it was pretty darn good, and it was clear that they were they were going places.
They're going up against the Altair, and I think everyone forgets about the Altair.
The Altair, and then there were other ones, again that were that were created by people who did not have the marketing and storytelling genius of Steve Jobs and Regis McKenna, that are never really went very far. But they're not to diminish the technical marvel that was Woz's Apple II motherboard, like that it was something else, but nonetheless, I think that the story of Regis McKenna and the story of Apple itself is sort of underscores the importance of storytelling, not just storytelling about a product in advertising. Think about those. One of the joys of the internet is you can find all the old early Apple ads easily by doing a Google search from the 77, 78, 79, 80, and they are marvelous. And they are such a stark contrast to the way that these machines were marketed before, which is all about tech specs and it's black and white and it's super nerdy and you have to know what they're telling you. You have to be a pretty technical person to understand the value. And instead, what Apple does, and this is something that, McKenna's advertising, marketing, branding, positioning, and also Steve Jobs as storyteller is able to talk about, this is something you consumer who have, $2,000 in your pocket, you you don't think you need this, but you do. And this is why. This is how it's going to empower you, make you more creative, make you be able to just be better at being you. The print ads that Apple ran in the Wall Street Journal prior to its IPO in 1980 were Steve Jobs talking about when we invented the personal computer, or invented the personal computer, which they didn't, but anyway, we'll take it. It's like a bicycle for the mind. Think about that. The bicycle for the mind. What a powerful image. Immediately we get it. Oh, okay, I can walk from point A to point B at a certain speed. But if I get on a bike, I'm still powering it. It's all me. I'm making it go, but I have this machine to make me go faster. And being able to talk about these devices, which were esoteric, they didn't do much. They were, it's only when they get someone builds a spreadsheet program that's compatible for the Apple that it actually has a use in the office. It's still pretty niche. And so that is, and I think there's the story of the products, and then there's the story of the place, the story of the guys in garages, the story of this entrepreneurial genius. And that's a great, great story. It's part of the story. It leaves out this bigger landscape of government and society and people who are non-technical people, the Regis McKennas of the world, who are so instrumental in making all this happen. I know as a historian, storytelling is powerful. That's how you help people understand and relate. And so Silicon Valley has been such a good storyteller.
Yeah, and of course, there are other fortunes that were made that had nothing to do with tech, right? So, Arrilaga, that's another big, right? Real estate, and other industries. But I want to get to the politics of this, because I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley would identify themselves as libertarians, and they believe in free markets, right? And I think for a certain period of time, there were people that thought that the whole notion of lobbying or, getting involved in politics was somehow a distraction at best, dirty at worst. But there has always been, right, some political involvement. National Venture Capital Association was created. A couple other entities that you mentioned were created specifically to lobby the government, especially for things like the lower capital gains tax rate, which probably played an instrumental role in getting venture capital off the ground.
Yeah. The National Venture Capital Association is founded in the 1970s to lobby Washington, D.C. for, among other things, lower capital gains tax rates, which is interesting. They do play a critical role in lowering them. They're part of a bigger story, but this is an important kind of test case for these political neophytes. These, VCs know a lot about things, but they don't really know much about how Congress works, and so they go.
Yeah, I remember. Initially Reagan was, didn't want to treat capital gains differently, right? Wasn't there some story where they kind of got flipped at some point?
Yeah. Well, the story starts in the Carter administration, of all things, and when the capital gains tax rate was really high. And we talk a lot about the Reagan Revolution, but the 1978 tax reform bill, which a Democratic-led Congress passes when Carter's still president, is actually kind of the beginning of the Reagan Revolution. And among other things, it lowers the capital gains tax rate, which, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of, the research is you talk to any VC, particularly from that era, and they're like, oh yeah, this is what unleashed the market was stuck and this unleashed things.
Carried interest, right?
Yeah. And I think the research is a little more mixed. I think that my take is that, what it undeniably did, it was a shot in the arm of confidence, of this kind of belief in risk capital and a kind of championing of entrepreneurial capitalism, which then ascends even further in the Reagan era and is championed by Reagan, particularly both rhetorically and also in economic policies. But also, I think it's sort of what you sort of about Reagan is important, is that Reagan's Reaganomics in its earliest iteration was kind of like generally business friendly, but not necessarily tech savvy. And there were a lot of things that frustrated the semiconductor makers, the chip makers, and others about, you aren't really, you're giving tax breaks, but they aren't really the ones that are useful to us. You aren't recognizing our distinctive need for accelerated depreciation and research and development tax credits and things that have been really important to the industry. And also, the same thing that what's happening at the same time is that Japan is eating America's lunch when it comes to electronics, and especially consumer electronics. And so there's an interesting kind of, in the early 1980s, you have sort of two Silicon Valleys that emerge. There's the personal computer industry, which is booming and growing and doing great, and kind of not paying much attention to politics because they don't need it, but the winds are blowing their way. And then there's the chip industry, the semiconductor makers, who are getting hammered by Japanese competitors and are going to, even though the leaders of these companies are by and large conservative Republicans, sort of libertarian-leaning small government types, they're going to the Reagan White House and being like, give us some trade protectionism, please. We need some tariffs. And so there's this kind of, Silicon Valley has always contained multitudes of interests, right? We even see this today with the big tech companies. The platform companies have different lobbying priorities. Apple has a different stance on privacy than Meta does, for example, right? And the same thing happened in every era of Silicon Valley. You have different parts of the industry that have different political priorities. But the bottom line is they were always lobbying. They were always playing. Even people like Steve Jobs, who famously kind of was so politically diffident in the 1980s. In 1984, a reporter asked him, who are you voting for in the presidential primary? Because that was when Gary Hart was challenging Walter Mondale in the Democratic primary. And Jobs was like, I've never voted for president. I don't care. I've never voted in my life. Like, essentially, this matters nothing to me. What he left out was that 2 years before that, he had spent a couple of weeks in Washington, D.C. lobbying for tax credits for computers in schools. So he knew exactly, the value of having government on your side. They just were, it wasn't very cool to show it.
Now, when we get to the Clinton administration, I mean, a lot of people would ridicule Al Gore, and say, "Oh, he claimed that he invented the internet. He's full of hot air." But I mean, there was in the Clinton administration, they did ultimately become very deeply involved in promoting technology, right? I mean, I think Al Gore was, along with some of his other senators, before taking office as vice president, in this club where they would teach each other how to use computers and stuff.
Yeah. Gore and Newt Gingrich were two technophilic members. They're probably the two most technophilic members of Congress in the 1980s, funnily enough. Yeah, and no surprise, the 1990s boom happens when Gore is vice president and Gingrich, after 1995, is Speaker of the House. I think that's, there's a connection here. Yeah, Gore, yes, infamously kind of got, tarred with you're claiming you invented the internet. In his defense, he didn't quite do that, but what he did do, actually, which was really important, is he sponsored what was known as the Gore Bill, this bill that essentially reinforced the internet and created enough, strengthened the backbone so that it could be commercialized effectively, kind of set things in motion for the commercialization of the internet in the early 1990s. One detail I discovered after the book came out, but I just love this. I love historical confluences, when sort of certain world events happen on the same time. The same week that Yeltsin et al. Signed the accords that officially dissolved the Soviet Union in December 1991, I think it was the day before, the day after, that was the day that George H.W. Bush signed into law the Gore Bill that essentially kind of allowed set in motion the commercialization of the internet. So you have the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the internet era almost at the same moment, and no one really noticed. So, but what happens in the 90s is that the Silicon Valley, which had been by and large been a very, very Republican place, it's, these are business leaders. They tended to vote Republican. And the Reagan administration had been, eventually had been strong allies. and supporters. The George H.W. Bush administration was not quite as, enthusiastic. They weren't unenthusiastic, but there were fewer people who really got what Silicon Valley was doing, and that was some source of some frustration. So by the time Bill Clinton comes up in 1992, presenting himself as a new Democrat, bringing on his running mate, one of the, Senator Gore, one of the few people who really was paying attention to the technical side of computing. The Valley was ripe for the taking, so to speak. And in September 92, a group of Valley CEOs do a group endorsement of Clinton, which was sort of sent shockwaves through the Valley. This was a real switch. And that's really when this tight alliance between Democrats and the Valley began, one that's only started to fray in the last few years.
And wasn't there some event where they had to essentially arrange a meeting with Clinton and kind of persuade him to switch his stance on some important policy?
Well, there was in the early Clinton administration, there was a dust up over what was known as the Clipper chip, which was this kind of a way for the NSA to have a back door into consumer technology. Sound familiar? And that was something that the Valley kind of forcefully pushed back against, and that Gore for a while was being kind of not in their good graces, and then that kind of got that out of the way. It was interesting. There was the Clinton administration was very much kind of a pretty consistent supporter of the internet industries, but also, had close ties to the telecommunications industry and other players that weren't necessarily on the same side when it came to how are we going to regulate commercial internet? Who gets to, what gets to flow? Who gets to gatekeep? And the Telecommunications Act of 1996 which was kind of was and is kind of the major regulatory framework on which this whole internet economy has grown, was really something of a battle between the young Davids of the internet industry, the small companies, the scrappy underdogs, and the Goliaths of telecom and the cable companies. And the Davids turnout had got enough of a smooth runway to eventually become Goliaths.
Now, look, part of the story, even though the book is about Silicon Valley, you have to talk about Seattle, right? I mean, and, Silicon Valley seems to be morphing and expanding. I'm in Berkeley right now, and people in Berkeley like to say that they're in Silicon Valley. I'm not sure how that, whether the cartographers would agree with that. But I think oftentimes people will toss in Amazon and Microsoft as kind of being part of Silicon Valley. So, to what extent has the ecosystem in Seattle been sort of co-evolving with what happens in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I think it's very much co-evolved. In a way, there's a symbiotic relationship between San Francisco Bay Area and Seattle that is in something of a latter-day parallel to the relationship between the Bay Area and Boston in an earlier era. And by that, I mean kind of flows of people and money and ideas back and forth. The proximity, the geographic proximity between Seattle and the Bay Area has been a major, major factor. I mean, in some ways, Seattle's very much its own place and space, but it is something of Silicon Valley North, even though the culture here is different, and it's much more of it's a big company town. It's a town that was sort of dominated first by Microsoft, then by Amazon, now by both.
Before that, Boeing.
And Boeing before that. Like we have, from the get-go, first it was the big timber companies, then Boeing, then Microsoft, Amazon, Costco, Starbucks. We have a lot of startups up here in Seattle, but really these big companies have sort of defined the ecosystem to a far greater degree than we see in the Bay Area. And it's a smaller economy, relatively speaking, but the two biggest companies are the biggest among the biggest of the big. I think that, one way we see the symbiotic relationship playing out is that Seattle has a relatively small venture community. There's just, you would think, given how much tech activity is here, that there would be a lot more venture capital concentrated here. And there is, but not as much as you might imagine. And part of it is because it's a 2-hour plane ride to go down and raise money on Sand Hill Road or San Francisco. That there is, and so that
You also don't have the non-compete
you don't have the
policy that
non-compete.
we have in California.
That's right. That's right. And the non-compete, that's such a wonderful example of, this is, again, you can't really plan these things. No one planned this, but this is a quirk of California's 19th century constitution that you can't enforce non-compete agreements in California. So it allowed this job hopping. Whereas in Washington state, it's different. Yeah. And so this is, I think, temperamentally, this is a big company town. I think the sort of legal environment is different here. The tax environment is different here. There's no state income tax, much to the joy of some tech employers and employees. But also, I think there are also trade-offs in terms of services and investment in education and that sort of thing. But I think they were and are very closely tied ecosystems. Microsoft, Bill Gates got Microsoft's first venture investment from Sand Hill Road venture firms. Jeff Bezos did the same. And now the back and forth of people, ideas, and money continues. And I don't see these regions in competition necessarily. I see them as two halves of a whole.
Well, speaking of legal, I mean, you touch on the kind of legal innovators in Silicon Valley, like Wilson Sonsini and so forth. I mean, that was something that really struck me when I moved out here. I'm a lawyer, and I realized these people do things completely differently. Out here legally, these lawyers, they do things that people on the East Coast would never even imagine.
Yeah. Wilson Sonsini, kind of the great. This is, again, part of the Silicon Valley secret, or, law firms, venture firms, marketing firms. Wilson Sonsini started off as a two-man small town legal shop in Palo Alto. And they just developed this really early expertise in advising these young companies on the very particular legal, they were a very bespoke firm. And they were, San Francisco law firms weren't doing that. Right. It was something that was very, very particular to the Valley, the early Valley. And then also, doing kind of the venture model of being an investor in these companies, taking a stake in lieu of fees. And that obviously was something very beneficial to these firms. So there's a really distinctive ecosystem that is still kind of unmatched. Again, going back to venture, look at the map of the United States and where the venture capital is, and you see it sort of dotted around the country, and you see this enormous giant bubble in the Bay Area, even as tech itself has become more dispersed. How there are more tech hubs in more places than there were. It has become deconcentrated to some degree, but the money can move, right? The money has, these firms have really continued to be so dominant and really run the board in many ways.
Yeah, but even though there are many more people, many more companies, and a lot more money, it still has that kind of small town feel, right? I think part of what contributes to the success of Silicon Valley is the kind of intensity of the network. And, you're only, 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from pretty much everybody else in the Valley. And so information flows incredibly quickly through these channels.
Yes, it is still a small town.
And everything still closes at 10 o'clock.
And everything still closes at 10 o'clock. Yeah. And there's still 5 restaurants. And And people's kids are playing on the same soccer teams, and you're living in the same neighborhoods, and you're having this kind of very intimate day-to-day existence. Now, I think this, of course, is both the secret of Silicon Valley, and I think it's Achilles' heel too. Right. So I think as Silicon Valley has gotten so extraordinarily wealthy and so powerful, and particularly the very, very, very top of that pyramid, the most wealthy and the most powerful are living this very charmed and rather isolated life. It's the other tech bubble, right, of extreme wealth and that can lead to groupthink.
This is your next book, right?
Yeah. This is, that these are, I think it's very difficult, if you're living the charmed, sunny existence, sitting at the town and country, having delightful ice cream, and living and, biking your way through Old Town Palo Alto and flying private, and again, this is simply just something that has come to some of the people at the very top, at the center of power. We've had this centralization and concentration of power as the tech industry itself has evolved, and you have kind of waves like the current AI wave, which requires a heck of a lot of money and resources to do. So big players, they're just getting bigger in it. That is, it does become very difficult to sort of see the wider picture. I think a lot about, I think it's a similar phenomenon to the, phenomenon that is clearly observable in the White House, the White House bubble, right? It's very hard for a president. I saw this when I was working in Washington, D.C. Like when you're in the West Wing, it is this extraordinary bubble of privilege and separation from and specialness. And a leader has to be very good about having people around him who's willing to tell him that he's wrong and do you have to work extra hard to sort of stay in touch with the way that ordinary Americans might be feeling. And I think the same thing, to some degree is I observe that happening in Silicon Valley today, where you have, people who are extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily successful, many of whom became very successful at very young ages. And in some ways that kind of traps you from seeing the bigger picture, and I think also the tight networks of, working together, funding one another has also contributed to the homogeneity of the Valley, right? It still is very much an overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white male place at its very top echelons of power and money, and that's, that's an observable fact, and I think that's can also contribute to not necessarily understanding the way when you're shaping the way the world works, and maybe you don't realize all of the downstream effects you might have.
Yeah, of course, that's another theme of the book, because I think most people in Silicon Valley think of Silicon Valley as a meritocratic place. Part of the reasons why they came there is because they did not want to have to deal with the organizational politics of the big companies and so forth. But it's, again, even though it is meritocratic, certainly more meritocratic than so many other places, there does seem to be a distribution of demographics that is, highly skewed. You talk about the paucity of women in high roles in Silicon Valley. I mean, to what extent does the belief in meritocracy sort of get in the way of seeing where it is maybe failing to meet its promise?
Yeah, I think that the belief in meritocracy, in a way, it's sort of siloed this the issue of diversity or lack of it as something that is sort of orthogonal to the business of building great tech, which I think is really unfortunate, because there are business costs to having that, not having a diverse array of perspectives, particularly when you're making and marketing products to a global consumer base, among other things, and also having impact on other realms like politics and things that are far beyond, the technical. I think the meritocracy, that belief comes from I think where it's grounded is that the Valley has indeed been a great escalator of opportunity, if not a rocket ship of opportunity for people that otherwise would not have had that opportunity, starting with the scholarship kids who came out there to work as engineers in the 1950s, to the immigrants from South and East Asia who start coming to the Valley in sort of great numbers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and sort of form networks of their own. But that also, it kind of this emphasis on, well, we're a meritocracy. If you have a good technical idea, you're a good technical person, we don't care what color you are, we don't care what gender you are. And what that does is kind of erases the history of engineering programs that were all male and that, kept women out actively, were able to for a very long time, or MBA programs that, Harvard Business School didn't admit women as MBA candidates until the 60s. So you have this, and also if you have a kind of ecosystem that is very much where the winners of one generation pick the winners of the next. And so much of it is about kind of, I just have intuitive sense of you're going to be successful. And so much of the venture model is not just money, but mentorship. And you want to work really closely with people and form close personal relationships and friendships and take them out for pancakes every Tuesday and talk about how to build their company. it is a lot easier to do that. And sort of you fall into these patterns of favoring and funding people who look like you, who are coming from the same worldview, who kind of have the culture fit, as they say. And that is, even if no one's putting a sign on the door saying no girls allowed, it has functioned to do that over time. And it is intensified as the money has gotten bigger. You would think that, okay, Silicon Valley's so rich, so many people have become, multimillionaires, if not more, through this amazing tech engine. Surely we're going to get more, a more diverse pool of people because everything's bigger now. And that hasn't happened. If anything, we're seeing the people